And my friend, is Bible history. We're continuing. We're at the period of the divided kingdom. The one before this, of course, was the united kingdom, Saul, David, Solomon. And we started explaining now last week the divided kingdom. And this is the roughest part of Bible history because you have these two kingdoms running concurrently, simultaneously. The kingdom split under Rehoboam, and Rehoboam ends up in what we call the southern kingdom. Judah, the two-tribe kingdom, just Judah, Benjamin, that's all. And then Jeroboam is king number one. In Israel, the northern kingdom, the 10-tribe kingdom. Now, I have my Bible open to 1 Kings chapter 12. And if you mark your Bible and follow this system, you will never, 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 never get confused about this difficult period in biblical history, which some go to their death and never get it untangled. But you'll have it. You don't need to be a seminary professor to figure this out because we follow this little plan. And in the southern kingdom, which is Judah, we're numbering the kings, J1, J2, J3. The northern kingdom, the 10-tribe kingdom, which is Israel, we're numbering I for Israel, I1, I2, the kings. And so in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1, you have Rehoboam. And in the margin near his name, you should mark J1. And then we have Rehoboam, which comes up, or rather Jeroboam, in the northern kingdom. And he takes charge of the people. And you find his name in 1 Kings 12, here we are, verse 20, Jeroboam, I1. Now, you have it. So we're going to turn the pages. We're not going to discuss every little detail, but we're just going to move on through 1 Kings and get these one by one. And as we turn them over, I'm now to chapter 14, and in verse 20, Nadab is the second king in the northern kingdom in Israel. So by verse 20 of chapter 14, you're underlining Nadab, and you're writing in the margin, I too. You have him. Mentions Rehoboam in verse 21, so that's J1 again. And then in chapter 15, verse 1, you have Abijah, and he's the second king. He follows Rehoboam, so he's J2. Now we're in chapter 15 and verse 16. And it says, Baasha, I3 he is. He's the third king in the northern kingdom. Over in verse 25, Nadab again, he's I2, but he's going off the scene. And verse 27 is Baasha, he's I3 again, so you're keeping track. And then again in verse 33, Baasha is mentioned. He's I3, of course. That number doesn't change. It's the same person. And then we're over into chapter 16 and verse 6. Baasha slept with his fathers. It's a nice way of saying they had a funeral. And then comes on the scene in verse 6, Ella. You're underlining Ella in 1 Kings 16, 6, and he's I4. Now it mentioned in verse 8, Asa, king of Judah. Oh, so that's going to be J3, the third king in Judah. Staying with me, verse 10, we're to Zimri, and he's I-5, and he reigns right there. Now, when we come down to verse, where are we, 22, Omri, he's the sixth king in Israel. So Omri, chapter 16, verse 22, is I-6. And now we're to verse 29, and you're underlining Ahab, and he's I-7, the seventh king in Israel. Now, you're underlining also on verse 30 that Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, and you're underlining more than all who went before him. He's the most infamous king, the most wicked king in either kingdom. And you're underlining in verse 31 his notorious wife, Jezebel. Any wicked woman, is called a Jezebel, after Jezebel, who was Ahab's wife. Now, Ahab could think of all kinds of evil things to do, but when he ran out of ideas, there was Jezebel. She had another long list of all kinds of things to do. And so now we're over to chapter 17. And it says, Elijah the Tishbite. Here is this famous prophet. There are several ways to divide the prophets. One is writing prophets, that is, prophets who wrote Bible books. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the rest of them. But then there are non-writing prophets, prophets who were very important, but actually did not leave a Bible book behind. But they left some footprints behind, left a legacy, no question. Elijah is important. Handel wrote a whole oratorio on him. Elijah is mentioned 111 times in the Bible, in 12 different books. Yes, he is important. And he worked miracles. And as we go through here, we are going to number the miracles of Elijah. And then when you think of the Old Testament and the kings and the prophets, you're thinking of actually First Kings is Elijah. Second Kings is his successor, Elisha. And both of these are in the northern kingdom in Israel. Elijah didn't show up in Judah, and neither did Elisha. These two prophets, both non-writing prophets, Elijah and Elisha, are in the northern kingdom. A evil king, Ahab, and a gloriously holy prophet, Elijah, to confront him and call him and his terrible wife to repentance. So let's start on the miracles. You've underlined, of course, the name of Elijah in chapter 17 here. Now, he comes to Ahab and just makes a startling announcement in verse 1 at the end. Neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. Oh, drought, famine, death. No dew or rain these years, but by my word. And then he vanishes. So Ahab can't get to him. That's miracle number one. He calls off the rain. So you got M1 in the margin, no dew or rain. Miracle one. Miracle number two, verse 6, the ravens brought him meat, bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. Special delivery of his meals. It's hard to improve upon that. Now we talk for seniors about meals on wheels. Well, here are meals on the wing brought by the ravens. That's miracle number two. Well, why didn't the ravens eat it themselves? Why did they bring it to? This is a miracle, verse 6. And then he goes to the widow who has nothing left in this time of drought and famine, and we're down to verse 14. And the flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty. So the widow takes him in, and her supplies are not exhausted. Verse 14, miracle number 3, actually. And then you got the widow's son dies in verse 23. He's brought back to life. That's miracle number 4, verse 23. Now, chapter 18, after many days, actually 3.5 years, Elijah shows up and meets Ahab. And so here are the prophets of Baal that we read in verse, where are we here? 19, 400 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of Baal, 400 of Ashtaroth. And so Jezebel, these were her pets, these false prophets. And these prophets of Baal, a pagan god. Now, if you had attended Harvard Divinity School, you would pronounce this Baal. And anybody who does that, you know where they got some of their education. But we in the Midwest, we're plain people. We don't put on any airs. We just say Baal. You were raised on that, no doubt, and so was I. And there's going to be, they build an altar, and the God who answers by fire will be God. In chapter 18, verse 38, the fire of the Lord fell. Miracle number 5 it is. And the people say, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. In verse 45, Elijah prays for it to rain. And it does. Verse 45, a great rain, miracle number 6. We're tallying up here for Elijah. And then he flees for his life, of course. And after this, it's time for Elisha to come on the scene, and his name first appears. Elisha is Elijah's successor. Chapter 19, verse 19, underline Elisha's name. And he comes on the scene at this time. And Ahab is mentioned in chapter 20, verse 13. And remember, he's I7. You're underlining and putting that in the margin again. There's some wars. And the story about verse 21, very interesting. Naboth's vineyard, and we're over to chapter 22 and verse 2. It mentions Jehoshaphat, and what do you know? He is J4. He is in the southern kingdom. Now we're coming down to the end of the book of First Kings, and verse 40 of chapter 22, Ahab slept with his fathers. And Ahaziah, you're underlining Ahaziah in verse 40, and he's I7. 8. I-8. He's mentioned again in verse 51. Now, Elijah is still on the scene as we go into 2 Kings, and if you haven't read 2 Kings, I want you to read it for next week. And we start out with 2 Kings, verse 1, the death of Ahab, I-7, and Moab rebelled against Israel. And verse 2, Ahaziah, I-8. And then these children really, they were young men who didn't know any better, come out. And it's miracle number 7. 2 Kings 1, verse 10. They're consumed by fire. Miracle number 7 with Elijah. And then, oh my, go down with me to verse 17. So he died according to the word of the Lord that Elijah had spoken, and Jehoram became king in his place. I-9, Jehoram. But then it says, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. And this is where it gets confusing. You have 2 kings, the same name, one in Israel, one in Judah. So the first Jehoram in verse 17 is I-9, but the second Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, is J5. And we're down to chapter 2, and Elijah is swept up to heaven in a whirlwind, does not die. And then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up, and he's talking to Elisha, and they are parted. We're chapter 2, verse 8. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, struck the water was parted. Miracle number 8. Miracle number 8. And then something very interesting in verse 9. Elisha, his successor, says, Elijah said to Elisha, ask what I shall do for you. And he said, let me have a double portion of your spirit. Oh, my. Now, this is interesting. And then, of course, Elijah swept up to heaven in a whirlwind of following this chariot of fire. Elijah performed 8 miracles. Elisha said, I want a double portion of your spirit. And the reason we've been numbering Elijah's miracles, 8 of them, is because now when we come to Elisha, and we're going to pick this up in the next session, Elisha performs 16 miracles, a double portion of his spirit. So we're going to pick it up here, read through 2 Kings for the next round here, and start noticing Elisha's miracles. Read 2 Kings, we'll be all set, and we hope to finish up the divided kingdom next time and see how the difficult has become workable and understandable.